Hey everybody, it's Spear here, and today we are kicking off a brand new series very similar to my R-Type 101s in style, where we're educating the player base on certain aspects of the game. I'm calling it Strategy 101, and I'm going to focus on the little things about a card game, the little strategies that you can go into, understanding the basics, and just build up that general knowledge to further your ability to play the game. This is something that a lot of players have been asking me on Twitch. Hey, do you want to do, what strategies would you recommend? Can we do playtesting and yada yada? And I think doing this type of series where I go over the things that I consider and I go through whenever I'm playing a game will really be able to help the community be able to push through and, expand their gameplay, level up their gameplay even further. With that said, guys, if you guys want to catch me live, however, ask me questions after or during playtesting sessions or anything like that. I go live every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and on weekends whenever I play tournaments. So links to the Twitch will be down in the description below. But without further ado, let's get into memory management. The biggest aspect of the game, right? This is how we manage our costs, this is how we play things, and this is how we're able to force our opponent into awkward positions if we do it correctly. Memory management is probably the biggest skill that you can learn in this game in terms of being able to level up your gameplay. So here we'll go into the many aspects of memory management that can lead you to being able to play better and force your opponent into these awkward positions that they can't really do much about. First, we'll hit on some basics just to make sure we're on the same page here. Once a memory gauge moves over to your opponent's side, your turn ends is the basic rule of the card game, but there are a couple of intricacies in there in that fact. First off, and let's just bring up our memory gauge for these examples, we have the fact that combat resolves completely. So if you swing in with, let's say, a Grizzlymon has an ability that says you lose 2 memory when it attacks. Even though at this point your memory gauge would go over to 2, it is still combat, which means combat resolves completely, which means no matter what, you will be able to get that security check or get blocked or whatever that may be before the turn is passed, which is something to keep in mind, which is how a lot of games tend to finish. You attack with everything else and then you have an opening. Oftentimes you'll see that blockers are the one to close out the game because they're the last attackers and the one they're able to get in, even if the memory gauge goes over to your opponent's side. The other caveat is that all skills resolve completely, which means even if the memory gauge goes over to your opponent's side, that doesn't matter because until all the skills resolve, it is still your turn. So what do we mean by this? Let's say I have a Lilithmon here, we're at 0 memory, and I opt to use Night Raid, which costs 2. So then it would go over to our opponent's side when we play it. However, Lilith has an ability that says when you play an option card, gain 2 memory. So we played our Night Raid, we paid our 2, Lilith procs off. The ability is still on the stack for any of Magic players, even though it's not really a stack, or the chain, like some Yu-Gi-Oh players would understand. That still has to resolve before it even passes over to our opponent's turn. So then it returns back to 0, and because by the time all our skills resolve, the memory gauge is back at 0, that means it's still our turn because it has not officially passed over to our opponent's side. So those are the two biggest caveats for the turn passing, and there's things to keep in mind when you're playing decks like Lilithmon or decks that can gain memory, like, if you're playing a Leomon or anything like that and you swing into something that makes you lose memory, you will be able to gain that memory back and be able to go to a place where you continue on your turn before passing it over to your opponent. Very, very skill intensive in the later halves of the game where you're trying to figure out what moves you can expand on, what plays you can push while still being able to keep the tempo on your side. Then there's memory choke, which is the act of keeping your opponent at 1 memory on their turn. You could generalize this to say keep them below 3, because if you pass your turn without doing anything, it puts them at 3. So technically anything below that is forcing your opponent to make a less optimal play. But for the most part, generally when people are talking about choking, they are saying keeping the opponent at 1. This is done in a multitude of ways, whether it's playing vanillas for cheap. Oftentimes, if your opponent puts you at 1, you'll make a free Evo on your rookie, and then you'll just play a 2-drop rookie to put them back at 1. Another one is cheap evolutions. Green is phenomenal at doing this, whereas, you'll play 1. So let's say it's your turn 1 and you see Blue Omnilists do this all the time. You see green decks do this, where they'll evolve their rookie into a 1-cost champion, which puts your opponent at 1. And now you're at a champion while they're probably going to have to put you at 2 or 1 themselves to be able to do the same thing. Blue and green decks are the best choke decks in the game. Generally, they're the ones that manipulate memory the most or have the most efficient costs. With blue, you have things like Hammer Spark, you have things like Leomon, you have the inheritable Gomamon. All these cards really allow you to mitigate your memory and essentially place you at whatever energy you need to be able to make the most efficient play and still be able to choke out your opponent, which is super valuable. Green can do so in a similar fashion by using its cheap costs. A lot of champions in green do so, and in set 3 we even see download go even further into making them have cheap evos and being able to set up very annoying choke point plays. Naturally, any deck can choke. Most decks have a myriad of costs. They have 2-drop vanillas, they have a number of 1-cost champions, so mostly any deck can do it, but because of the memory manipulation that blue and green have access to, they're the ones that generally do it the best. Granted, this is as far as set 1.0 and 1.5 is. Later on we could see this change, but this is the general idea. If you're great at managing your memory in terms of effects or having cheap costs, you will be the better choke deck. On the other side of that coin, I think black decks are the most susceptible to choke rate, and at least at the moment, just because the archetypes in black are very thin. There's not much you can go off of. They're big, heavy plays, and unfortunately a lot of big tempo plays that you make in black are just that. They're just tempo, but it's tough because it's never hard removal. If we take Machine Dramon here for example, it's a huge 12 cost play, so obviously way out of choking realm, but just to exemplify the kind of plays blacks make, where you're Digivolving your opponent's cards, which is great, but you're not removing the cards, which means your opponent still has the ability to attack into you using those cards, and it just exemplifies black's issue where if it's not able to get off multiple plays its turn to be able to move the tempo on its side whenever it does things like this, it's gonna have a hard time. Of course, decks like these use these phenomenal tamers that gain you back memory. Utilize them to the best of their abilities. Recognize if your deck is one of the decks that can't afford to be choked. Black is a deck that I think needs the Taikamias. If it doesn't, it falls way too far behind. Recognize if your deck is one of those decks and use tamers or any other cards that allow you to be able to gain memory on your turn so that you can mitigate the fact that your opponent is trying to choke you out. Let's jump into dead opening hands. Now there are so many aspects, and we will touch dead opening hands on so many different strategy 101s, but on the memory management aspect, always make a play. I know a lot of players, I've had it done to me where opponents will just pass to me trying to not give me too much memory to be able to make a play and then see if they can maybe top deck out of the issue. The problem with that, guys, is never rely on a top deck. If we look at this opening hand here, let's say we had 2 Plezios, 2 Hammersparks, and Omnimon, pretty much a dead hand, right? Most would consider this. I think you just go off, you set up your following turn, and you set up cycles. You want, to the best of your ability, set up a play that means you're going to start being able to see more cards and start getting on pace with what your opponent is doing. Here, I would just say play out the Pleziomon, set up the Omnimon for next turn. It does 2 things, right? You're setting up Omni, which means you can remove whatever your opponent does. And also, you're starting to draw cards again, which is what you need to do to unbreak your hand. Unbreaking is the biggest thing you can do. If you have a level 5, man, you just play that level 5 because that means you're going to be able to evolve on top of him and start drawing cards again, which means that you're going to be back on pace of what your opponent is doing and hopefully fix out your hand. The problem with just passing or not playing out a dead hand is that you're effectively saying, okay, the next card on top of my deck is going to fix it for me, which is terrible. You never want to rely on the top deck to be able to fix it for you. Top decks are just that. They're RNG, they're top decks. That's why they're top decks. The biggest thing is you have to push your play, because the only thing that changes by passing your turn is that you may have 1 more memory if your opponent decides to choke you, and you've just given board establishment priority to your opponent, who was the first one to be able to set up a Digimon. He had 3 memory to go off of to make a great play, and he's ahead of you because you decide to establish nothing while putting your opponent ahead. You have to mitigate that. You have to make a play. So if you're ever in a position where you don't have much going on, set up the play that allows you to cycle the most and allows you to actually start pushing your game plan, even if it's not the most optimal way to do it, because otherwise all you're doing is you're setting yourself behind for free and your opponent has all reign to take advantage of that. And it's not guaranteed that your opponent has a great hand either. Maybe your opponent has just as much of a dead hand as you do, and you being able to push the envelope whereas they're not willing to do so will put you ahead and allow you to be able to expand the game plan even further. Finally, matchup knowledge. Every deck manages memory differently, guys. There's really no set way to deal with one specific deck. They all do it differently, and even all the colors do it differently. You know, Omnimon manages its color differently than, let's say, like a Garurumon tribal list or a Greymon list. You know, there's definitely different ways to do it, and knowing what matchups you're going up against will allow you to be able to make better plays against it. Let's take Blue Omni here. It takes 11 memory to go through an entire Omni stack. and that puts your opponent at 1. So if you give your opponent 10, recognize that they have the ability to go from start into an entire Omni stack off of a rookie and still choke you out at 1. But the biggest thing to know is that the magic keyword memory for blue is 5. 5 memory allows them to get Omni on board from a rookie, going through from your champion all the way to your mega to then plop them down and put you at 6. You're going to be at 6, which still gives you a lot to work with, and is why blue Omni mirrors are so weird, because if you're in a position where you put Omni on this magical 5, you're putting your opponent at 6, it gives them enough memory to actually go into their own Omni once again, which makes for a lot of Omni counterplay, and it's kind of what makes the mirror an actual interesting gameplay position, depending on how you're playing it out. But always keep that in mind, guys, and that's one of those matchup knowledge things. You just know that at 5 memory, my opponent can play down Omnimon. Another thing is that blue has memory spark. So sometimes 5 memory is actually 4 memory, or 3 memory if they double spark. And these are just kind of things you have to keep in mind when you're playing against this matchup. Additionally, knowing what a deck's memory requirements are opens up a ton of counterplay opportunity, because you're able to limit or at least push for a certain play that they might not be able to make or that they want to make. If we take purple, for example, here we have Piedmon, probably one of the best cards in purple, biggest tempo swing in the game, where for 12 memory, you get to play out 2 purple level 4s from your drop, on top of him being a 10k retaliation. Huge body, very powerful, but he costs 12. Memory choke locks out Piedmon from the game. Putting the purple player at 1 means that it is impossible for them to be able to go into their Piedmon play. Of course, every deck has counterplay though. Be aware of the board state. If they have a level 4 that has Kaimon under them, they can crash it to then get that 1 to be able to play out the Piedmon afterwards. But this is where your skill as a player comes in on matchup knowledge. Let's say I have the ability to evolve one of my Digimon, but that would put my opponent at 2, but I would get an additional card out of it. However, instead, let's just say I hard played that Digimon, and it would, or hard played a different Digimon that would put my opponent at 1. Sure, I lose, I'm not cycling a card. I'm losing out in card advantage that I would have. But while I do go down a card in my hand, I'm forcing my opponent to 1, meaning that he can't Piedmon me. And if I know I'm in a position where the only out my opponent has is Piedmon itself, then I'm putting myself in a winning position. And these are those memory management, matchup knowledge things that you get to know the more you practice matchups, the more you understand what your deck is trying to do and what your opponent's deck is trying to do. And you can make counterplays like these that allow you to swing the game huge in your favor if your opponent can't really play around you playing the memory game better than they can. So the best thing I can recommend is try and understand what decks are trying to do, specifically what their memory requirements are, and go from there. Like another thing for purple, let's say you die to a Devimon. Well, Devimon costs 2, so if you choke your opponent, he won't be able to go into Devimon without first passing it over to your turn, so you know you're going to get more value from your cards that way. Just one of those things to keep in mind. And with that said, guys, that was our very first strategy 101 on memory management. I hope this gave you a little bit more insight as to the ways you can attack certain matchup and the way to start thinking. These strategy 101s aren't going to be the end all be all about making you guys a top-notch player, but they're opening up the way to get you guys thinking about how to play your cards out, how to play the strategy out, and try and consider matchups and understand what decks are trying to do so that you can counterplay and beat them over. With that said, what did you guys think of the first strategy 101? I have a number of these coming out to cover multiple FS the game. If there's a specific strategy thing that you guys want me to cover, let me know in the comments down below, guys. I am currently working up my repertoire of the different things I want to go over. Different topics I'm going to go over are things like being the control deck, being the aggro deck, and different aspects of the game that will alleviate some of these pressure points that you might be feeling as you're playing with the game. Again, let me know in the comments down below, guys. I'm really excited for this new series. With that said, if you like these kind of videos, give it a thumbs up. Hey, if you dislike it, thumbs down works too. And if you want to catch more of these videos, whether it be Digimon gameplay, tournament reports, or guides like these strategy and archetype 101s that I post out, subscribe button's down in the corner. And with that said, I'll catch you guys on the next one. Ciao.